Denise Matthews pulled her 15-year-old Honda Civic into the circular driveway of a Buckhead mansion on a Tuesday morning in October, the Georgia autumn air crisp enough to make her breath visible as she gathered her canvas nursing bag from the passenger seat. She'd driven past houses like this countless times on her way to shifts at Piedmont Hospital, never imagining she'd be walking up to one as an employee. The mansion rose before her, like something from Architectural Digest, all gleaming marble columns and floor-to-ceiling windows that probably cost more than she'd made in her last 3 years of ICU nursing. Her hands trembled slightly as she locked the car, not from the cold, but from the weight of what she'd committed to attempting. Marcus Chen stood in the marble foyer, checking his Apple Watch, the kind of restless energy that comes with inheriting massive responsibility before you're legally old enough to drink, radiating from his every movement. His Armani suit was perfectly pressed despite the early hour, but his face carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying the weight of $100 million company for 8 months without a break. At 19, he was the youngest CEO in Chen Medical Technology's 40-year history, thrust into boardrooms filled with skeptical men twice his age who questioned every decision with barely concealed doubt. The pressure had carved lines around his eyes that belonged on someone much older. Dr. James Chen sat motionless in a custom wheelchair by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring through glass so clean it seemed to disappear into the October morning. The man who'd once commanded operating rooms with the confidence of a conductor leading a symphony now spent his days watching the world beyond the windows, unable to participate in the life he'd built. 3 caregivers had quit in 6 months, each lasting longer than the one before, but ultimately defeated by the same impossible task of restoring function to a brilliant mind trapped in a partially paralyzed body. His silence filled the room like fog, heavy and impenetrable. The terms Marcus had offered were brutal in their simplicity and generous in their desperation. Double her Piedmont Hospital salary, bringing her monthly income to nearly $8,000 if she could get his father feeding himself again within 30 days. If she failed, Dr. Chen would be transferred to a long-term care facility in Marietta, and she'd be back to 12-hour shifts navigating the nightmare of Atlanta traffic between I-285 and the downtown hospital district, where ambulances competed with commuter cars for space on congested highways. The deadline hung over everything like a sword suspended by fishing line. Marcus had inherited Chen Medical Technologies when his father suffered a massive hemorrhagic stroke 8 months earlier, the kind of catastrophic brain injury that changes everything in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Every board meeting felt like a performance review he was failing, every quarterly report a test of legitimacy he hadn't had time to study for. The investors were asking increasingly pointed questions about leadership stability and succession planning, their confidence shaken by having a teenager at the helm of a medical device company that employed 4,000 people across 3 states. Sleep had become a luxury he could no longer afford. The whispers followed him through the corporate offices on Peachtree Industrial Boulevard, employees discussing whether the company's founder had made a catastrophic mistake in trusting his teenage son with an enterprise that had grown from a 2-person startup in a strip mall to a major player in cardiac medical technology. Every decision was scrutinized, every policy change analyzed for signs of inexperience or poor judgment. The pressure was relentless, compounded by watching his father struggle with tasks that had once been automatic. Some nights he sat in his Tesla in the parking garage, afraid to go home to witness another day of his father's decline. The physical therapist tried everything, Marcus said, gesturing toward a converted bedroom that resembled an expensive rehabilitation center more than living space. Resistance bands hung from professional wall mounts, electrical stimulation machines sat unused on rolling carts, and a parallel walking system dominated the room's center like a monument to costly failure. We brought in specialists from Johns Hopkins, flew in a consultant from Mayo Clinic. Dad just gave up after the 3rd month. His voice carried the bitter taste of money spent on false hope. Denise nodded politely, but her attention was focused on James, rather than his son's recitation of expensive failures. The older man's right hand rested on the wheelchair's padded armrest, fingers relaxed but not lifeless, and when Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21 drifted from the built-in sound system, she noticed something significant. His fingers moved in subtle rhythm with the music, tapping against the black leather in deliberate patterns that suggested preserved motor pathways buried beneath layers of depression and wounded pride. It was the kind of detail that revealed more than any MRI scan. In 15 years of neurological nursing, she'd learned to recognize these small rebellions against brain injury, the tiny signs of function that most people missed in their focus on dramatic improvements. A finger tap synchronized with music, an unconscious adjustment of posture, the way someone's eyes tracked movement despite their inability to respond verbally. These details revealed more about neurological status than expensive diagnostic tests, offering glimpses of preserved function that could be built upon with the right approach. She'd seen miracles hidden in movements so small they were almost invisible. "Tell me about his eating patterns," she said, pulling her attention back to Marcus, who was fidgeting with his watch in what appeared to be a nervous habit developed since becoming CEO. "He won't even attempt it anymore. Maria, our housekeeper, feeds him everything. Pureed vegetables, protein shakes, foods that don't require chewing or coordination. The neurologist said he's lost 23 pounds since the stroke, and his muscle mass is deteriorating faster than we expected." DeMarcus's voice carried the weight of someone who'd become fluent in medical terminology he'd never wanted to learn. Every pound lost felt like another step toward the inevitable. James turned his head slightly at the mention of his weight loss, a movement so subtle it might have been unconscious, and Denise caught something crucial that previous caregivers had overlooked: shame. The deep, corrosive variety that comes from having strangers discuss your failures while you sit 3 feet away, reduced from participant to subject, unable to defend yourself or simply leave the room when the conversation becomes unbearable. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle memory of control in a body that no longer obeyed his commands. She pulled a burgundy leather chair next to his wheelchair, positioning herself at his eye level in deliberate contrast to the way most people towered over wheelchair users. "Dr. Chen, I'm Denise Matthews. I worked neuro-ICU at Piedmont for 8 years before switching to home care. I've seen extensive stroke recovery, and I've watched people regain independence in ways that might surprise you." Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd witnessed the impossible become routine. James met her eyes for the first time since she'd entered the house, his gaze still sharp, despite the obvious fatigue that clouded his features like fog over the Chattahoochee River on winter mornings. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, each word carefully formed, as if speech itself required enormous effort and conscious control. "The others tried everything. I can't. My hand doesn't work properly anymore. I drop everything I touch." The defeat in his voice was complete, the surrender of someone who'd exhausted hope. "I noticed you keeping time with Mozart just now. Your fingers, I mean. That tells me more about your motor function than any of those expensive machines in the therapy room." She gestured toward the equipment-filled bedroom, where thousands of dollars worth of rehabilitation technology sat gathering dust, symbols of well-intentioned but misguided attempts at recovery. The equipment looked impressive, but had failed to address the human being who needed to use it. Marcus stepped forward, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with the sharp sound of authority he was still learning to wear. "Wait, you actually think there's hope?" Because the neurologist was pretty clear that the damage was extensive, and after 8 months of minimal improvement. His voice cracked slightly on the word hope, as if saying it aloud might jinx whatever possibility existed. "Hope is a strong word," Denise said carefully, knowing that false optimism could be more destructive than honest assessment in neurological recovery. "But I think we've been approaching this incorrectly. Nobody's asked what Dr. Chen wants to accomplish or how he wants to accomplish it. Everyone's been trying to make his hand work the way it used to work instead of discovering what it can do now." She'd learned that adaptation often succeeded where rehabilitation failed. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. The first week was dedicated to observation rather than intervention, a methodical process of understanding patterns that previous caregivers had rushed past in their eagerness to demonstrate measurable progress to anxious family members. Denise arrived each morning at 7:30 after Marcus had left for the office in his black Tesla Model S. But before Maria began her daily routine of maintaining surfaces that never seemed to accumulate dust in the meticulously clean house. The mansion felt different in these quiet morning hours, less like a showplace and more like a home where healing might be possible. She brought her own coffee in a battered stainless steel thermos, strong and black, the way she'd learned to drink it during countless overnight shifts in the ICU, and established herself as a quiet presence during James's breakfast routine. She watched how he held his napkin, noting the precise way his fingers gripped the cloth, despite his obvious frustration with fine motor tasks that had once been automatic. She observed how he positioned his arm on the wheelchair's adjustable tray, tracking the unconscious micro-adjustments he made to stabilize his posture and accommodate his altered center of gravity. Every movement told a story about preserved function and adaptive strategies. Most importantly, she documented how his coordination fluctuated throughout the day, noting subtle variations that corresponded to medication schedules, meal times, energy levels, and external stimulation. Previous caregivers had treated his tremor and coordination issues as static problems to be overcome, rather than dynamic conditions that varied predictably based on timing and circumstances. This approach had led to frustration when exercises that worked at one time of day failed completely at another. She began to see patterns where others had seen only chaos. The breakthrough came on Thursday morning at 11:20. Unremarkable in timing, but revolutionary in its implications for everything that followed. James was attempting to butter a piece of whole wheat toast, his hand shaking so severely that butter flew off the knife and landed on the polished mahogany table. He'd already given up twice, each failure adding another layer to his visible frustration, his jaw clenched with the effort of controlling emotions that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. The simple act of preparing breakfast had become a battleground where he lost every engagement. But Denise had spent 3 days mapping his patterns, tracking fluctuations that revealed themselves only through patient observation and careful documentation. His tremor was worst in the morning hours, severe enough to make simple tasks impossible and devastating to his confidence. It improved gradually after his 10 o'clock medications, a carefully calibrated cocktail of blood thinners and muscle relaxants that required time to reach therapeutic levels in his bloodstream. Around 11:15, there was a 45-minute window when his coordination approached something resembling normal function. This window had been invisible to everyone who'd tried to help him. "Dr. Chen, what if we tried this again in about an hour?" she suggested, her voice carefully neutral to avoid implying judgment about his current struggles or false promises about future success. "It won't be any different. Nothing's different anymore." His words carried the accumulated weight of 8 months of failed attempts, countless moments of trying and failing, until the act of trying itself became more painful than accepting defeat and retreating into passive acceptance of help. Hope had become his enemy, a cruel tormentor that promised what it couldn't deliver. "Maybe not, but I'd appreciate it if you'd humor me on this one." At 11:20, she placed the same piece of toast in front of him, along with the same butter knife he'd struggled with an hour earlier. His hand was noticeably steadier now, his grip more confident and controlled. The tremor reduced to an occasional flutter that didn't interfere with deliberate movement. He managed to spread butter across half the slice before fatigue began to set in, but it was unmistakable progress. Measurable, observable improvement that could be documented, analyzed, and built upon systematically. The look on his face suggested he was witnessing magic. "I'll be damned," he whispered, staring at the successfully buttered toast as if it represented a minor miracle rather than a simple breakfast task. "That's a 45-minute window where your fine motor control is significantly improved," Denise explained, pulling out a small spiral notebook where she'd been tracking his patterns with the methodical precision of a researcher. "The medication is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. We just need to work with its timing instead of against it." She showed him the charts she'd been keeping, proof that his body still followed predictable rhythms despite the chaos the stroke had introduced. Marcus arrived home that evening to find his father eating vegetable soup in the formal dining room, using a regular spoon rather than the oversized adaptive utensils that had become standard equipment over the previous months. He wasn't eating smoothly or quickly, but he was eating independently, spoon to bowl, bowl to mouth, with minimal spillage and no assistance from Maria, who hovered nearby with barely concealed amazement at witnessing something she'd been told was impossible. The simple act of successful eating transformed the atmosphere of the entire house. "How is this even possible?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with an emotion somewhere between hope and disbelief, afraid to trust what he was seeing after months of disappointment. Every caregiver said his coordination was too damaged for independent feeding. He'd grown so accustomed to failure that success seemed suspect, too good to be real. "His coordination is fine during specific windows throughout the day," Denise replied, watching James navigate another spoonful with careful precision and evident concentration. "We just needed to identify when those windows occur and structure his meals around optimal timing instead of forcing him to eat when it was convenient for everyone else's schedule." The solution had been hiding in plain sight, masked by assumptions about how recovery should work. For the first time in 8 months, Marcus saw something resembling the confidence that had once made Dr. James Chen one of Atlanta's most respected cardiac surgeons, a spark of the man who'd built a medical technology empire through precision and determination. The second week introduced challenges that had nothing to do with motor function, medication timing, or rehabilitation techniques. Word had spread among the Chen Medical Technologies Board that the CEO's father was making unexpected progress, and suddenly everyone wanted to witness the recovery firsthand. Investors began dropping by for impromptu lunch meetings, their expensive German cars and Italian sedans filling the circular driveway like a luxury automotive show that announced to the entire Buckhead neighborhood that something significant was happening at the Chen residence. The parade of visitors disrupted the careful quiet that had become essential to James's fragile progress. Department heads discovered urgent reasons to work from the house, setting up laptops in the den and conducting conference calls that disrupted the carefully established quiet routine essential to James's progress. The steady stream of visitors transformed the peaceful environment into something resembling a corporate office, complete with the constant hum of business conversations and the pressure of being observed by people who expected to see dramatic improvement. The house felt invaded, no longer a sanctuary, but a performance space where James was expected to demonstrate his recovery for an audience. James, who'd been gaining confidence and competence in his private sessions with Denise, retreated into silence whenever visitors appeared in the house. The tremor returned with a vengeance, worse than it had been in weeks, and he absolutely refused to attempt feeding himself when others were watching. The 45-minute window of optimal coordination seemed to shrink under the weight of observation, as if being watched made his brain injury more severe and his limitations more pronounced. Privacy had become a medical necessity. "It's too much pressure," Denise told Marcus after a particularly difficult Tuesday when James had refused to eat anything substantial in front of two board members who'd lingered through lunch, discussing quarterly projections while stealing glances at the man who'd once led their strategic planning sessions. He's not a performing animal. He's a human being learning to feed himself again after a catastrophic brain injury. Her voice carried an edge of protective anger that surprised them both. Marcus was pacing the gourmet kitchen with its granite countertops and professional-grade appliances, his usual restless energy amplified by frustration and something that looked dangerously close to panic. But they need to see he's improving. The board meets next week about restructuring, and if they think I can't handle the company, if they believe I'm too distracted by family issues to make sound business decisions. His words tumbled over each other, revealing the impossible pressure he'd been carrying alone. Your father's dignity isn't a prop for your career advancement. The words hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire, harsh and acrid and impossible to ignore or take back. Marcus stopped pacing abruptly, his face flushing with what might have been anger or shame, or both emotions competing for dominance. He stared at her, then at his father, who sat by the window pretending not to listen while watching the Bradford pear trees that lined Peachtree Road turn brilliant gold in the afternoon light. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "You're absolutely right," Marcus said finally, his voice quieter and more thoughtful than she'd ever heard it. "Dad, I'm sorry. No more visitors during your mealtimes. This is your home, not a boardroom or a medical demonstration." Well, the apology carried the weight of someone recognizing a fundamental truth about human dignity. James nodded without turning around, but Denise caught him wiping his eyes with the back of his functioning hand, a gesture so subtle it might have been adjusting non-existent glasses if she hadn't been watching carefully. Week 3 was when everything nearly collapsed, when the fragile progress they'd built began to crumble under external pressures that had nothing to do with brain injury, rehabilitation, or medical recovery. James had been making steady, measurable progress, successfully eating approximately 60% of his meals independently during his optimal coordination windows. He'd even begun attempting more complex tasks, like cutting soft vegetables with a butter knife and drinking from regular glasses instead of the sippy cups that had become standard equipment. The improvement had been incremental, but undeniable. But then Marcus received a call from Richard Blackwood, the company's largest investor and a man who'd known James for 15 years, considered himself practically family, and wielded enough financial influence to determine the company's future direction. Blackwood was flying in from Boston specifically to see James, to offer what he called encouragement and support during this difficult transition period. Marcus couldn't refuse the visit without seeming ungrateful or raising questions about his father's condition that might affect investor confidence. Some obligations couldn't be postponed or diplomatically avoided. The visit proved disastrous from the moment Blackwood walked through the front door with his booming voice and aggressive enthusiasm that filled the house like an unwelcome thunderstorm. His loud, well-intentioned energy disrupted the quiet routine that had become essential to James's fragile progress, overwhelming the careful balance they'd established over 3 weeks of patient work. During lunch, nervous and overstimulated by the unexpected attention and pressure to perform, James knocked over a glass of ice water, the liquid spreading across the mahogany table in an expanding puddle that soaked through cloth napkins and sent ice cubes skittering across the polished surface. The sound of breaking glass might as well have been his spirit shattering. He dropped his turkey sandwich twice, each failure more humiliating than the last, in front of a man who remembered when Dr. James Chen could perform 12-hour cardiac surgeries without a tremor in his hands. Finally, he pushed his plate away in complete frustration, while Blackwood watched with the kind of forced smile people wear when witnessing something painful they can't fix and don't fully understand. The meal became a public execution of his dignity. The older man, genuinely trying to be encouraging but lacking any understanding of stroke recovery dynamics, patted James on the shoulder with patronizing familiarity and said, "Don't worry, Jim. You'll get there eventually. Just takes time, that's all. Hang in there, buddy." The words were meant kindly but landed like physical blows. After Blackwood left in his rented BMW, promising to check in again soon and keep the other investors updated on James's progress, James didn't eat for 2 consecutive days. He refused to even attempt feeding himself, sitting in his wheelchair with his hands folded in his lap like a defeated chess player, staring out the window at nothing particular, while the carefully constructed routine they'd built together collapsed completely around them. The regression was swift and devastating. "He's embarrassed," Denise explained to Marcus, who was pacing the kitchen like a caged animal, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the pressure of watching his father's regression. Adult men who've spent their entire lives being competent and respected don't recover well from public failures, especially when someone they respect and who knew them in their prime witnesses the humiliation. She'd seen this pattern before, the way shame could undo weeks of progress in minutes. But he was doing so well just yesterday. He ate that entire grilled cheese sandwich, used the knife to cut it into triangles, drank a whole glass of milk. "I thought we'd finally turned the corner on this thing." Marcus's voice carried the bewilderment of someone watching success transform into failure without understanding why. Recovery isn't linear, especially with brain injuries. There are setbacks, bad days, periods of regression that can last for days or weeks. The question is whether you trust the process enough to weather the storms or panic at the first sign of trouble. Her words were meant to comfort, but she could see him struggling with the uncertainty that brain injury recovery demanded. Marcus stopped his frantic pacing, his expensive shoes no longer clicking against the ceramic tile. "What would you do in this situation?" I'd give him space to process what happened. I'd remind him that learning to do anything again after a brain injury requires more courage than most people ever have to find in their entire lives. And I'd make absolutely certain he understands that his progress matters infinitely more than anyone else's timeline or expectations. The formula was simple, but required patience that felt impossible when watching someone suffer. That evening, Marcus found his father in the den, staring at a framed photograph from the company's 20th anniversary celebration. In the picture, James was giving an animated speech to a room full of employees and investors, confident and commanding, his hands gesturing expressively as he spoke about innovation and patient care and the future of cardiac medicine. The man in the photograph bore no resemblance to the silent figure in the wheelchair, separated by 8 months and a catastrophic brain injury that had redefined everything about his existence. The contrast was cruel in its completeness. "I used to be somebody important," James said without looking up from the photograph, his voice carrying the profound weight of loss that accompanies traumatic life changes. "You're still somebody important, Dad. You're just somebody different than you were before the stroke. I can't even eat a simple sandwich without making a mess that embarrasses everyone. I can't sign my own name legibly. I can't drive a car. I can't perform surgery. I can't run a company. What exactly am I now besides a burden?" The litany of losses poured out like water from a broken dam. Marcus sat down in the chair Denise usually occupied during their sessions, positioning himself at his father's eye level rather than towering over him the way most people unconsciously did with wheelchair users. 3 weeks ago, you couldn't hold a fork steady enough to feed yourself. Today, you held one for 20 minutes and ate most of your lunch before that visit disrupted everything. That's not nothing, Dad. That's actually pretty incredible progress. He was learning to see victory in increments rather than dramatic transformations. James studied his son's face for a long moment, seeing something there that hadn't existed before the stroke transformed their family dynamics. Patience, perhaps, or a deeper understanding of what constitutes real strength. When did you become so wise about these things? I hired an excellent teacher who's been showing me what real courage looks like. Share your take in the comments. What felt like the turning point for you? By week 4, they'd established a sustainable rhythm that accommodated everyone's needs while maximizing James's opportunities for independence and dignity. Breakfast at 11:15, precisely timed to coincide with his peak coordination window when morning medications had reached therapeutic levels, but fatigue hadn't yet begun to interfere with fine motor control. Lunch at 2:30, after his afternoon medications had taken effect, but before the natural energy dip that occurred around 4 o'clock. Dinner at 6, enhanced with modified utensils that Denise had researched and ordered online to accommodate his specific grip strength limitations and tremor patterns. The schedule became sacred, protected from interruption. The modified utensils represented the key breakthrough that nobody had thought to attempt. Simple solutions that proved more effective than thousands of dollars worth of high-tech rehabilitation equipment gathering dust in the converted therapy room. Instead of forcing James to use standard silverware that required fine motor control he no longer possessed, Denise had located weighted forks and spoons with built-up handles specifically designed for people with neurological conditions. The additional weight provided stability that counteracted his tremor, while the enlarged handles accommodated his reduced grip strength and allowed for more secure control. Sometimes, the simplest solutions were the most revolutionary. She'd also discovered that plates with raised edges prevented food from sliding off during cutting or scooping, dramatically reducing the mess that had become such a significant source of embarrassment and barrier to progress. Simple adaptations that cost less than $50 total, practical solutions that previous caregivers had overlooked in their focus on restoring normal function rather than intelligently accommodating altered capabilities. The difference between rehabilitation and adaptation, between trying to fix what was broken and learning to work successfully with what remained functional. The philosophy shift changed everything. Why didn't any of the other caregivers think of this approach? Marcus asked, watching his father successfully cut a piece of grilled chicken with a rocker knife designed specifically for one-handed use. The specialized tool allowed him to cut food using a pressing and rocking motion rather than the bilateral sawing action that required coordination he no longer possessed. Because they were focused on fixing his hand, instead of accommodating what his hand can actually accomplish now, Denise replied, making detailed notes in her observation journal about his progress with each piece of adaptive equipment. There's a fundamental difference between rehabilitation and adaptation. Sometimes adaptation gets you much farther than trying to restore what's been lost. The insight had applications far beyond medical recovery. The real test arrived on day 28, when Marcus had to host a crucial board meeting at the house because the conference room at Chen Medical Technologies was undergoing renovation, and the only alternative was his father's dining room. He'd promised faithfully that there would be no visitors during mealtimes, but the meeting stretched well beyond its scheduled conclusion, as board members engaged in intense debate about quarterly projections and discussed a potential acquisition that could double the company's size and market reach. The timing couldn't have been worse, colliding with James's dinner hour like a perfectly orchestrated disaster. Several board members were still present at 6 o'clock when dinner was scheduled to be served, their voices carrying from the dining room, where they'd spread financial documents and laptop computers across the polished mahogany table. Marcus was desperately trying to escort them to his father's study, but they were deeply engaged in discussion about market expansion and competitive positioning, the kind of high-stakes business conversation that had once been James's specialty and greatest source of professional satisfaction. The irony was painful in its completeness. "Dr. Chen?" Denise said quietly, finding James in his wheelchair positioned just outside the dining room doorway, listening to the familiar rhythm of strategic business discussion that had once defined his professional identity and daily existence. "Your dinner is ready when you are." She could see the conflict playing out across his features, the war between hiding and reclaiming his place. "I can't eat in front of them," he whispered, his voice tight with anxiety that bordered on panic. "What if I drop something? What if I can't cut the meat properly? They'll think I'm completely incompetent, that Marcus can't handle running the company because he's too distracted taking care of his invalid father." The fear in his voice was primal, the terror of exposure and judgment. "You've been cutting chicken perfectly for the past week. Yesterday you managed an entire meal without spilling anything. Last week you ate soup without assistance while carrying on a conversation with Maria." She reminded him of victories he'd forgotten in his anxiety. "But they knew me before this happened. They remember when I was building this company from nothing, when I could perform 12-hour surgeries and negotiate million-dollar contracts without breaking a sweat. Now they'll see me struggling to accomplish what a 5-year-old takes for granted." The comparison to his former self was devastating in its accuracy. "They knew you when you were different, that's true. But they don't know you now. And the person you are now has learned to do something most people take completely for granted after your brain was severely injured. That's actually more impressive than anything you accomplished before the stroke." She meant every word, understanding that some victories were harder won than others. James sat quietly for a moment, listening to the voices from the dining room discussing market penetration strategies and profit margins with the confident authority of men who'd never had to relearn how to feed themselves or sign their own names. Then he straightened his shoulders with visible determination and wheeled himself purposefully toward his customary place at the head of the dining table. The decision was made, irreversible. Marcus tried to intercept him, his face flushed with panic and protective instinct. "Dad, you don't have to do this. We can eat in the kitchen, or I can ask them to move to another room." "Yes, I do have to do this. This is still my house." The words carried an authority that transcended physical limitation. The business conversation stopped abruptly when James positioned his wheelchair at the head of the dining table, the same spot where he'd presided over countless family dinners and informal business meetings throughout his children's lives. The board members, all successful men in their 50s and 60s who'd known and respected James for years, watched with barely concealed discomfort as Denise placed his adapted dinner setting in front of him. The weighted utensils, the plate with raised edges, the modified napkin holder that kept his napkin within easy reach, all visible symbols of his altered capabilities. The equipment told a story they weren't prepared to read. James picked up his weighted fork with deliberate precision and cut a piece of chicken with his rocker knife, the movement careful and controlled despite the slight tremor that was visible to everyone at the table. His concentration was intense, each action requiring conscious thought and effort, but he successfully brought the food to his mouth without incident. Then another piece, and another, each bite a small victory, each successful movement a demonstration of hard-won competence that bore no resemblance to the effortless coordination he'd once possessed. The silence was profound, respectful. The room fell completely silent, except for the gentle clink of modified silverware against ceramic and the soft hum of the central air conditioning system maintaining perfect climate control. Outside, evening traffic moved along Peachtree Road in the familiar rhythm of Atlanta rush hour. But inside the dining room, 7 successful businessmen watched a stroke survivor eat dinner with a dignity that transcended physical limitation and challenged every assumption about disability and worth. The lesson was being taught without words. After 15 focused minutes, James had consumed most of his dinner without assistance, navigating green beans and mashed potatoes with the same careful precision he'd once used to repair damaged human hearts in operating rooms across Atlanta. He set down his fork with quiet satisfaction, wiped his mouth methodically with his napkin, and looked around the table at faces that showed a mixture of genuine admiration and something that might have been shame for their earlier discomfort. The transformation in the room was palpable. "Gentlemen," he said in his quiet post-stroke voice, each word carefully articulated and deliberately chosen, "I believe you were discussing the market expansion proposal." More, the return to business was seamless, natural, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. The meeting continued for another productive hour, with James contributing occasional insights about customer relationships and product development, his institutional knowledge still sharp and valuable despite his physical limitations. The board members gradually relaxed into normal conversation patterns, treating him as the valued advisor he'd always been, rather than an invalid to be pitied, asking his opinion about strategic decisions and listening to his responses with the genuine respect they'd always shown his business acumen. The evening had restored something precious that everyone thought was lost forever. When the visitors finally departed, shaking James's hand with authentic warmth and promising to keep him informed about the acquisition discussions, Marcus found his father still sitting at the dining table, staring at his empty plate with an expression of quiet satisfaction and exhausted pride. "I'm incredibly proud of you, Dad. What you just did took real courage that most people never have to find. I'm proud of myself too. I honestly didn't think I had that kind of strength left in me." The admission was soft, vulnerable, the voice of someone who'd rediscovered something valuable about himself. The following morning, Marcus called Denise into his home office, a room lined with business books and framed awards that reflected his father's 4 decades of professional achievement and community recognition. On his mahogany desk sat a thick folder containing documents and spreadsheets, research that had clearly required weeks of careful preparation and analysis. The proposal represented more than a business decision. It was a statement of values. "I've been thinking extensively about what you said, about dignity and adaptation and meeting people exactly where they are instead of where we think they should be. I'm listening." Chen Medical Technologies employs 4,000 people across 3 states. A significant percentage of them have aging parents or family members with disabilities. Many of them are going to face exactly what we've been dealing with, and they're going to need professional help navigating these challenges without destroying their careers or their family relationships in the process. The problem was bigger than one family, more widespread than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Denise waited, sensing that he was building towards something substantial and carefully considered. "I want to establish a comprehensive program. Corporate-sponsored home care services for employees who need support caring for family members with disabilities, chronic illnesses, or age-related conditions. I want you to design the entire initiative from the ground up." The offer was comprehensive, ambitious, and entirely unexpected. "Marcus, that's a significant undertaking. I'm not talking about a superficial charity program or some feel-good public relations initiative that looks impressive in the annual report, but doesn't actually help anyone in meaningful ways. I'm talking about a real employee benefit, funded at $2 million annually, that provides people with the kind of professional expertise and emotional support that you've given my father." The commitment was serious, backed by substantial financial resources. Denise examined the folder carefully, impressed by the thoroughness and professionalism of his preliminary research. He'd already identified potential partner agencies throughout the Atlanta metropolitan area, contacted established home health organizations, developed preliminary cost analyses, and even drafted a comprehensive budget breakdown that accounted for different levels of care needs and family circumstances. The proposal was detailed, well-researched, and clearly the result of serious consideration rather than impulsive emotional response. This was business planning at its finest. "You're completely serious about this investment. Absolutely serious. My father spent 40 years building this company on the principle that medical technology should improve people's lives in practical, measurable ways. This program is simply an extension of that founding philosophy, applying it directly to our own workforce instead of just our external customers and patients. The continuity between past and future was elegant in its simplicity. And you believe the board will approve a $2 million annual expenditure? That's a substantial financial commitment, especially for a program that doesn't directly generate revenue. After what they witnessed last night? After watching a man eat dinner with grace and dignity 8 months after a massive stroke that could have destroyed his sense of self-worth? After seeing firsthand what becomes possible when someone receives the right kind of professional support? I'm confident they'll approve it unanimously. 3 months later, the Chen Family Care Initiative was featured prominently in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution as an innovative approach to employee benefits that other major companies were already attempting to replicate across various industries. The program had successfully helped 12 families navigate complex care situations ranging from post-surgical recovery to early-stage dementia support, providing both practical assistance and emotional guidance that traditional corporate benefits packages simply couldn't address effectively. The success stories were mounting, each one representing a family that didn't have to choose between career and caregiving. The newspaper article included a photograph of Marcus and James at the company's annual shareholders meeting, the younger man standing behind his father's wheelchair as they reviewed quarterly reports together with obvious mutual respect and collaboration. James had been officially named Advisor Emeritus, a newly created position that allowed him to contribute his extensive expertise and institutional knowledge without the pressure of daily operational responsibilities or the stress of managing a large organization. The role gave him purpose without overwhelming him with demands his altered capabilities couldn't meet. James continued making steady progress throughout the winter months and into the following spring. He never regained full use of his left side, and he never returned to the effortless coordination and manual dexterity he'd possessed before the stroke, but he achieved meaningful independence in crucial areas of daily living. He could eat independently during his optimal coordination windows, write short notes and sign documents with his adapted pen, and had begun attending monthly board meetings as a valued advisor whose insights shaped important strategic decisions. The limitations remained, but they no longer defined him. His weight stabilized at a healthy level for the first time since his stroke. His depression lifted significantly with the return of purposeful activity and meaningful contribution, and he'd even begun discussing the possibility of eventually learning to drive again using hand controls. These were small victories by objective standards, but they represented a life worth living. An existence that bore little resemblance to his pre-stroke reality, but contained its own forms of satisfaction, accomplishment, and personal meaning. Progress had been redefined in terms that mattered. Marcus had learned something about leadership that no MBA program could have taught him, wisdom that couldn't be found in business textbooks or corporate case studies. Sometimes the most important business decision you can make has absolutely nothing to do with profit margins, market share, or competitive advantage. Sometimes it's about recognizing that the people who work for you are complete human beings with complicated personal lives and family members who need care, and that supporting them through those challenges creates loyalty, commitment, and organizational strength that no salary increase or bonus structure could possibly purchase. The lesson extended far beyond the boardroom. Denise had discovered something profound as well, though it took her several months to fully articulate what it meant to her professionally and personally. She'd spent 15 years in hospital settings, helping people through the acute phases of medical crises, stabilizing patients and managing symptoms during the critical first hours and days after injury, illness, or surgical procedures. But there was something deeply satisfying about staying with someone through the long, slow, often frustrating work of rebuilding a meaningful life, about being present for the small victories that nobody else would ever notice, celebrate, or understand the significance of achieving. The work required different skills but offered deeper rewards. The ripple effects of the Chen Family Care Initiative extended beyond the company's employees to their families and communities. Grandparents received professional support that allowed them to age in place with dignity. Parents with disabled children found resources they'd never known existed. Spouses recovering from major surgeries had access to expertise that prevented complications and accelerated healing. The program addressed a hidden crisis that had been affecting productivity and morale across the company for years, as employees struggled to balance demanding careers with the overwhelming responsibility of caring for vulnerable family members. Marcus began speaking at business conferences about the initiative, sharing data that demonstrated how supporting employees' caregiving responsibilities actually improved retention, reduced absenteeism, and increased overall productivity. The business case was compelling, but more important was the human case. Companies that invested in their employees' whole lives, not just their work lives, created cultures of loyalty and commitment that translated into tangible competitive advantages. The model was being studied and replicated across multiple industries. The program also attracted attention from healthcare policy experts who saw it as a potential solution to the growing crisis of family caregiving in an aging society. With baby boomers entering their 70s and 80s, millions of families were facing the same challenges the Chens had confronted. Traditional healthcare systems weren't equipped to provide the kind of individualized, long-term support that people needed to maintain independence and dignity while managing chronic conditions or recovering from major medical events. Corporate-sponsored programs like the Chen Initiative offered a promising alternative that could be scaled nationwide. On a Thursday afternoon in January, exactly 1 year after Denise had first walked into the Buckhead mansion, she was in the kitchen preparing James's lunch when genuine laughter drifted from the dining room. Real laughter, the kind that emerges from joy rather than politeness, spontaneous and authentic in a way that couldn't be manufactured or faked for social purposes. She looked through the doorway and saw James telling Marcus an animated story about his medical school days, gesturing expressively with his functioning hand, his eyes bright with memory and amusement, rather than the dull resignation that had characterized the early months of his recovery process. The transformation was complete, but not dramatic, earned through countless small victories. Marcus was listening with genuine interest and engagement, occasionally interrupting with questions or comments, treating his father like the intelligent, accomplished man he'd always been, rather than the patient he'd temporarily become. They were sharing a moment of authentic connection, father and son discovering new ways to relate to each other that didn't depend entirely on the roles they'd occupied before everything changed. The relationship had been rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect and hard-won understanding. The conversation turned to the company's latest acquisition, a small startup developing innovative cardiac monitoring devices. James offered insights about market positioning and regulatory challenges, his institutional knowledge still valuable despite his physical limitations. Marcus listened carefully, taking notes, treating his father's advice with the same respect he'd show any senior advisor. The dynamic had evolved from caregiver-patient to colleagues, from father-son to business partners, united by shared expertise and common goals. It wasn't the recovery anyone had imagined or hoped for 8 months earlier. James would never perform surgery again, would never give confident speeches to auditoriums full of medical professionals, would never be the commanding, physically capable presence he'd been before the stroke redefined every aspect of his existence. But he remained a man with valuable opinions, treasured memories, and fundamental human dignity. He was still someone worth listening to, worth caring for, worth adapting the world to accommodate rather than simply warehousing in an institution. The adaptation had worked both ways, changing not just him, but everyone around him. The Chen Family Care Initiative had grown beyond Marcus's original vision, expanding to include partnerships with local healthcare systems, community organizations, and other corporations interested in replicating the model. Denise had been promoted to director of the program, overseeing a team of care coordinators who worked with families throughout the Atlanta metropolitan area. The success had attracted national attention, with companies as far away as Seattle and Boston implementing similar programs for their employees. Maria, the housekeeper who'd witnessed James's entire journey from the beginning, often commented on how different the house felt now compared to those dark months immediately after the stroke. The mansion was no longer a place where someone was dying slowly, but a home where someone was living purposefully despite significant challenges. The atmosphere had shifted from resignation to determination, from grief to acceptance, from isolation to connection. And that, Denise thought as she watched father and son share a moment of genuine connection and mutual respect, represented perhaps the most important kind of recovery possible. Not the restoration of what had been lost, but the discovery of what could still be found and nurtured. Not the return to a previous life, but the creation of a new one that honored both limitation and possibility, both profound loss and enduring hope. The story wasn't about overcoming disability, but about redefining what it meant to live a meaningful life within the constraints that disability imposed. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dining room where James continued his story, his voice growing stronger with each word. Outside, Atlanta continued its relentless pace, but inside the mansion time moved differently, measured not in quarterly reports or surgical schedules, but in successful meals, meaningful conversations, and the quiet satisfaction of adapting to a new reality without surrendering dignity or purpose. The rhythm of this new life had its own beauty, its own meaning, its own worth. If you want more true, human stories like this one, hit subscribe and stay with us.